and welcome to another Spirit of Nature Art video tutorial. Today I'm going back to this little kittie's altered book here and the last page, which has been waiting for a little while. And I cut this beautiful flower out of a free magazine that was put through the door. It was a sales magazine basically for a local garden centre, and I spent quite some time fussy cutting it because there's lots of detail, and it's been sat there waiting for me to feel the right inspiration to get started. And it was these pages in an old botanical book that kind of got me started really. I'm just using some watered down liquid matte gel here just to start to collage these details onto this page here. I love all the little drawings and the wording that's used as well, all that botanical interest, which I thought just really kind of contrasted that very bright, very vivid flower. So I'm just collaging these on really. I'm kind of being aware of where the little illustrations are going to be. I want them really to stand out as much as possible. But other than that, I'm just really tearing it up, sticking it on. I've just put the flower back on the page there, just where I want it to go so that I can make the most of those illustrations. I want as many of them to be seen as possible. So there's no point me putting some really beautiful illustrations underneath where that flower is going to go because it will just cover them up. Now some people will ask, why are you bothering to tear it all up and collage it on, Caroline? Why don't you just take one big sheet of that page and just stick it on that paper? Well, you'll see a little bit later on why I do this. The texture that we get, which allows the colour to kind of form and pool on those lines, really kind of gives the page a lot more interest and depth. So, and also, do you know what? This is part of the creative process for me. I love doing some collage. It's really simple, really easy. Don't have to think too much about it. And suddenly the page is starting to form before my eyes without me really needing to kind of put pen to paper or do anything really, you know, kind of serious grown-up artistic wise. So this is always a great way to get started, get those creative juices flowing. And you can see now I'm literally just using some of the kind of spare leftover bits of that page to collage behind where that flower is going to be, because we're not going to see it. So I'm really not so fussed about that. So these bits here, you'll see it's just text. It just gives me the same texture to work with, and the inks that I'm going to use to colour it shortly will react in the same way to the whole paper, rather than having that bit of kind of cardboard in the background there from the original book page. Once that's all dry, I'm just going to tear the edges off. If I tried to do that tearing whilst it was still wet, it would be a horrible mess. You can use scissors if you want a really nice clean cut, but I quite like sometimes having that more raggedy edge. So now it's dry, just tearing all those excess bits off so that I can start to work on this page. And this here in my little pot is just some watered down white gesso, and I'm just using my finger to add that to the page. I'm concentrating particularly on the areas where the edges meet, so I'm just softening those edges. I'm also putting a little bit more on where the text is so that that starts to kind of fade into the background a little bit more. And you'll see in a moment that where I've put too much white over those images, because remember I want those illustrations to stand out, I just get my baby white, here we go, and just take a little bit of that gesso off the top just to make sure that those illustrations really pop and stand out and the text starts to sink into the background. I've chosen two colours to complement this flower. This is Picked Raspberry in Distress Ink Spray, and I've also got Dusty Concord as well, which I'll bring in shortly. Just dabbing a bit onto the page, squirting it with some water, moving the page around so it starts to dribble, and drying it as I go. If I dry each of these layers, we're going to keep some of that beautiful texture that we get from that paint moving around the page. If I just keep putting wet on wet, it's going to all merge together. Now when I put the next layer on, it will still activate it because Distress ink is water activated, but we're going to keep some of that detail and texture. Oh whoops, that's where I spilt my ink. Don't do that, by the way. This is where, as you can see, I'm putting another layer on here, just randomly placing it around the page, adding some of that water, moving it around the page. And this is where you start to see the impact of using the collage, because that water will kind of catch in those spaces where the paper overlaps and joins. And there is a lot of this, of me adding a layer and drying it, adding another layer and drying it. So I've kind of edited for you because you don't really need to see me using my heat tool and drying this, but really it's the same. Add some ink to the page, put some water on and move it around, and I like to dry it as I'm moving the page as well, just to capture some of those nice details, and then just layer it until you're happy with what you've got. And now I'm bringing in that second colour, the Dusty Concord, and just doing the same. Again, the drying in between layers, it means we're going to end up with both colours showing on the page rather than the two colours merging together. Of course, there will be some merging, but you're going to see two distinct colours and the areas where they blend. And I just keep putting my flower back on where I'm expecting to put it so that I can make sure I'm happy with how I'm doing building up these colours in the background. So I've edited out lots of this, but you get the idea. Put the ink on, add some water, move it around, dry that layer, and just keep going until you're happy with the result. So I've chosen two, get my teeth in. I've chosen two Derwent Inktense pencils that match the two Distress ink colours that I have chosen. So matching the Picked Raspberry and the Dusty Concord. And I'm just going around now and highlighting the edges of those pieces of paper that I tore up for the collage. So I'm literally just drawing around the edge, and those Derwent Inktense pencils are water activated, so I'm using my watercolour brush just to go in and activate that and soften it a little bit and just start to get this sense of these kind of this 3D depth on that page. Nice and therapeutic doing this, because again, it's like collaging. There's not too much thought to be had here, but there is that really nice gentle repetition, and also you really start to see the page start to come to life there. So again, I'm not going to make you watch me do all of this, but you can really start to see how the page changes as we add in that shading. How those straight lines going around the collage paper there contrast with that much more natural curvy lines of the flower. And I just keep going back over it until I'm happy, alternating between the two colours dependent on what the colour is on the page behind. So here we are, ready to place the flower permanently rather than putting it on and off the whole time. So I'm just using my tacky glue here just to get as much to the edges as I possibly can. Because there's so fine detail on the top of that flower, I am going to use a cocktail stick to get some onto those very tiny fine details right at the edge, because I really want this to stick flat to the page as much as possible. I'm just auditioning some stencils here. If you've seen some of the other pages in this book, you'll notice that there is some form of sort of mandala-y type stencil on each of them. So I want to follow that through onto this page as well. So I've chosen this stencil, I guess you could argue it's a mask, because it really complements the spikiness of the flower. So I'm using the Distress ink. I think this is Seedless Preserves, so very similar to Dusty Concord, and just dabbing that on around that mask, just being particularly gentle around the edge because it's a mask rather than a stencil. I don't want kind of really obvious lines where my dabber has been, so I'm just being careful how I do that. I think that looks quite nice. As you can see, it complements coming in from the two different corners, the top corner and the bottom corner with a flower. I'm just dabbing it there with a tissue just to kind of give it that distressed aged look already. So it's really, when you first put the ink on, it's very bright. So just a little wipe over with a dry tissue can really kind of fade the brightness of it so it feels a lot more kind of aged already. And now I'm just going around and edging using the same ink just to start to frame the page. And again, I have two pastel pencils that match that pink and that purple colour that is following all the way through here. So one of each, just like with the inks and just like with the Inktense pencil. Now I've chosen to use pastels here to do this shading around the flower because these don't need water to activate. So I'm drawing them on and I'm just using a paper stub to soften and blend them. And this really is to help make that flower look like I haven't just stuck it on the page, which of course I have, but when we add that shading and the highlights, it starts to feel like it belongs on that page rather than it's just been stuck on the top. So I'm using the darker pink around the bottom of the flower, and then as I move around towards the top of the flower, I bring in that kind of lilac-y purple colour. Here comes the lilac, just going around some of those more finer details there. And I kind of decided when I was softening that lilac pastel that I could really enhance that kind of spiky feeling of those little kind of stamens of the flower really coming out. So I've kind of swooshed those lines of the lilac out to kind of feel like there's a little bit of movement there as well. You can sort of see that there now that I've done more of that. And now time to emphasize that edging, that framing. That's what brings everything together. So this is one of my favorite techniques. If you've watched my videos, you will have seen me do this before. I'm just taking an old credit card and I'm dipping it in the ink and using that particularly to highlight the edges, but I quite like to do some mark making on the page itself. So just some of those little lines that again just age the page a little bit to stress it. I particularly like this style. As you can see, it's followed all the way through on pretty much every page that I've done in this little book here. It just kind of gives it that look of feeling like this was done many years ago. So I'm just using that credit card and that ink there just to do some mark making, like I say, particularly around the corners, just to give it that framed feel. I'm just going in with my white gel pen just to add some highlights to those leaves. Again, I always say that shading and highlights helps the focal image to both settle into the page and pop off it at the same time. We want it to feel like it belongs there, but we also want to really draw our attention to it. So I'm using that white gel pen there just to really bring out the highlights. And in a moment, I'm going to go in with my charcoal pencil and add some more shading, particularly around the edges of those leaves. So I'm not going over the pink shading that I've done with the pastel. I'm actually putting the shading on the image. So just adding that around the edges and also going in and darkening some of the already darker areas. So particularly around the tips of those leaves and right in the center of the flower as well. Again, as you can see the impact of that as you watch the video. And now I'm going to add some splatters. It's always a good one just to help finish the page off. This is Dina Wakley's acrylic gloss spray. So I just want to cover up my flower because I don't want the splatters going on the flower. I just want them going on the rest of the page. So giving that a good shake up and then not spraying it. I'm just taking the tube out and just dabbing it around so we get some nice white splatters. This is acrylic gloss spray, so always clean your work surface straight afterwards, otherwise it's really hard to clean it off. And once that's dry, I'm going back in with my picked raspberry distress ink and doing the same thing, just adding some splatters. Just helps to pull everything together. You can't go wrong with adding some splatters to the page. And now I like to add a little sentiment, so I've got this lovely bloom stamp here, and I'm using some Versafine embossing ink and some white embossing powder. So I'm just stamping that on, adding the embossing powder, dabbing it straight off, putting that excess powder back in the pot. Always put the lid on the pot because otherwise when you get the heat tool out, you'll find you blow it everywhere. And then heat tool on the highest setting to emboss that powder so you get that lovely 3D glossy effect. So I think these all match really nicely. I'm really pleased with the end product. I hope you are too. The one thing I didn't like was the front cover, so I will be changing that in the next video.